Subscribe to take your place in this universe full of science fiction and horror stories, and go after the unknown, because some truths are hidden in the dark. The council chamber was silent, heavy with the weight of an unspoken decision. Towering pillars framed the vast hall, their surfaces etched with the languages of civilizations that had once defied the Galactic Imperium and been erased from history. The vaulted ceiling, a gleaming void of black obsidian, reflected the cold, expressionless faces of those gathered below. At the center of the chamber, High Lord Varesh sat rigid upon his throne, his posture betraying none of the unease curdling in his gut. His long, skeletal fingers drummed against the armrest as he gazed at the image hovering before him. A rendering of a small, blue-green planet, unremarkable in the vast theater of galactic power. And yet, this insignificant world had become an anomaly. A problem. Earth, Varesh murmured, voice a low rasp that cut through the stillness. A ripple of unease passed through the gathered officials. They had known this name once, long ago, when the Imperium first cataloged the lesser races of the galaxy. Humans had been an afterthought, a species barely past their primitive phase, their brief existence marked by bloodshed and internal strife. When they were deemed too fractured and warlike to pose a threat, the Imperium had simply moved on. And yet, here they were again. A Zelari strategist stepped forward, its bioluminescent tendrils flickering with agitation. This should not be possible. The humans were insignificant when last observed. A race of short-lived creatures, bound to a single world, too consumed by their own conflicts to matter. Varesh's gaze sharpened. And yet they survived. More than survived. The latest intelligence reports painted a picture of something impossible. A species that had faced extinction more than once, yet refused to die. Wars that should have broken them had only made them stronger. Enemies that had subdued them found themselves outmaneuvered a century later. It defied logic, defied history. They should have faded, rumbled across Warlord, his massive form shifting restlessly. We have conquered species that once spanned entire star systems. We have crushed empires older than our own. And yet these things persist. Varesh said nothing, watching as new data scrolled across the holographic display. Humanity had not simply endured, it had grown. They were no longer scavengers of stolen technology. They were builders, creators, innovators. And now, for the first time in recorded history, they were preparing for war before war reached them. The Imperium had spent millennia shaping the fate of the galaxy, deciding which species would rule and which would be forgotten. Every empire that had risen had done so under their watchful eye, permitted only as long as it was convenient. But humanity had slipped through the cracks, unseen, unchecked. The truth settled deep into Varesh's bones. The humans were not supposed to exist, and that made them dangerous. He turned to the council. The solution is clear, he said at last. We erase them before they become a true threat. No one disagreed. The order was given. The fleet was mobilized. Across the cold reaches of space, the Imperium's war machine turned its full attention upon a species it had once dismissed, believing this would be the final chapter in an insignificant story. But unknown to the council, it was already too late. In the abyss beyond Saturn, where light barely touched and no empire's reach extended, a fleet lay waiting. Their hulls were dark as the void, invisible to long-range scanners, hidden within the gravity wells of dead moons. They had no official designation, no records in any known database. To the Imperium, they did not exist. And that was exactly how humanity wanted it. On the bridge of the Vanguard, Grand Commander Elias Kane stood with his hands clasped behind his back, watching the intelligence feed scroll before him. The Imperium had made its move. The extermination order had been signed. A slow smile, humorless and sharp, curved his lips. They think they've caught us unprepared, he murmured. Beside him, Commander Wren exhaled through his nose, arms crossed over his chest. They always do. Kane glanced around the bridge, at the men and women who had built this fleet in the shadows, who had trained for a war they had known was inevitable. They had lived their entire lives under the Imperium's shadow, breathing in the fear that one day the hammer would fall. But humans had learned something their enemies never had. They did not break. They're expecting us to defend, Kane said. To fight from a corner, to beg for survival. That's what every species before us has done. He let the words sink in before continuing, voice quieter, more dangerous. But we are not every species. Ren's lips quirked in the barest hint of amusement. No, we are not. Silence settled over the bridge, heavy with the weight of the moment. Beyond the viewport, the fleet remained still, waiting. Not for orders, not for permission, for war. The Imperium is coming, Kane said. He turned back to the stars, gaze locked on the abyss ahead. And this time we strike first. The void between the stars was not empty. It was a battlefield waiting to be claimed. The Vanguard hung motionless in the dark, its hull swallowing the faint light of distant stars. Around it, the fleet drifted in coordinated silence, invisible to all but the most sophisticated scans. This was no accident. Humanity had learned long ago that survival was not about strength. It was about adaptation, about being underestimated. On the bridge, Grand Commander Elias Kane studied the tactical display with cold precision. The Imperium's fleet had arrived at Proxima Gate. Thousands of ships, a moving wall of destruction, each vessel bristling with firepower. They had come expecting extermination, expecting to wipe humanity from existence before the first real battle had even begun. But the Imperium had made a mistake. They thought they were hunting prey. Kane turned to his officers, his voice calm. Status. Commander Ren was first to respond, his fingers moving across the control interface with effortless efficiency. Cloaking fields remained stable across the fleet. No Imperium vessels have detected us. Weapons systems primed. Troop carriers prepped. He hesitated, glancing at Kane. They still don't know we're here. Kane allowed himself a small, knowing smile. Good. For centuries, humanity had been the footnote of history, a race of short-lived scavengers dismissed by greater civilizations. But the Imperium had failed to recognize the pattern, the one thing that made humans different. They did not break, and they never forgot. The command table glowed softly, projecting a three-dimensional map of the enemy fleet. The Imperium's formation was efficient, disciplined, battlecruisers flanking heavier dreadnoughts, a perimeter of smaller corvettes patrolling the outer edges. At the center, heavily shielded, loomed the Nihilus, the personal warship of High Lord Varesh. The Imperium's war council was aboard that ship. Their strategists, their tacticians, their minds. Destroying a fleet was one thing. Destroying the reason that fleet could fight, that was something else entirely. They expect us to fight defensively, Kane said, his voice carrying through the bridge. They believe we'll bunker down, that we'll try to hold Earth at all costs. His gaze swept across the officers before him. That is why we will not be there when they arrive. A murmur passed through the assembled command staff. They had trained for this moment, but to abandon Earth's defense entirely? It was bold. It was reckless. And that was why it would work. Rin crossed his arms. We take out their supply lines, force them to divide their forces. Not enough. A voice cut in. Kane turned as Admiral Catherine Sato leaned forward in her seat, fingers steepled in thought. Unlike the others, she had remained silent during the briefing, watching, calculating. Now, she spoke with measured intent. A fleet can be rebuilt, she said. But strategy? That's harder to replace. She reached out, tapping the Nihilus on the display. We don't just cut off their resources. We take their command. Rin frowned. You're suggesting we board their flagship? Yes, Sato said simply. The room fell silent. Kane studied her, his mind already turning. A direct assault on the Nihilus would be suicide under normal circumstances. Its defenses were impenetrable, its corridors likely filled with security detachments trained for any scenario. But the Imperium had never considered the possibility of an infiltration. Why would they? No species had ever dared to strike at the very heart of their fleet. Rin let out a sharp breath. That's a death sentence if we're wrong. Sato met his gaze evenly. so is waiting for them to come to us. She was right. If the Imperium landed troops on Earth, the war would be over before it began. Humanity's only advantage was unpredictability. They couldn't fight this war conventionally, so they wouldn't. Kane exhaled, weighing the risks. If they failed, the Imperium would tighten its grip. No second chances. But if they succeeded, they wouldn't just be delaying the invasion. They would be crippling it. He turned back to the display. We'll need a strike team. Fast, efficient, adaptable. He glanced at Run. Assemble the best. Rin nodded, already compiling a list. Sada leaned back, satisfied. We disable their command, disrupt their communications, and get out before they know what hit them. Kane's expression darkened. No, we don't disable them. Rin looked up. Then what do we do? Kane's eyes flickered with something unreadable. We take them alive. Another silence fell over the bridge. Capturing a war council wasn't just a bold move, it was a declaration. The Imperium had never seen humans as equals, only as insects to be crushed beneath their rule. But if the council was taken, if High Lord Varesh himself was forced to kneel before them, the Imperium would have no choice but to acknowledge what it had tried to erase. Humanity was not prey. They were the storm that had come for the hunters. Kane turned to his officers. Prep the strike teams. We launch within the hour. The command deck erupted into motion. Tactical officers relayed orders. Strike commanders coordinated insertion points. Pilots ready to drop ships. The quiet hum of preparation filled the air, a symphony of calculated defiance. Kane stood at the center of it all, watching as the final pieces fell into place. The Imperium was coming. It would find no frightened, desperate survivors waiting for it. It would find something else entirely, something it could no longer control. Kane turned toward the viewport, his gaze fixed on the distant glow of Proxima Gate. They think they're the hunters, he murmured, but they just walked into our trap. The fleet advanced through the void, unseen, unheard. The Vanguard glided between the stars, its hull absorbing all light, a ghost in the darkness. Around it, warships moved in formation, silent predators in the abyss. No transmission signaled their presence. No engine flare betrayed them. The Imperium had always believed humanity incapable of true warfare on their level. Tonight, they would learn otherwise. On the bridge of the Vanguard, Grand Commander Elias Kane stood still, watching the enemy fleet through the tactical display. The Nihilus loomed at the heart of the Imperium's formation, a fortress of reinforced plating and cutting-edge defense systems. It was more than just a warship. It was the Imperium's central command, the mind that directed their forces. And if all went according to plan, that mind would be severed before it could strike. Status, Kane said, his voice calm, deliberate. Commander Rin barely looked up from his console. Cloaking fields holding. Weapons charged. Boarding teams in position. No sign they've detected us. Kane nodded, allowing himself the briefest flicker of satisfaction. The Imperium was arrogant. They had never expected humanity to fight back like this. They thought they had broken them, reduced them to a desperate species clinging to survival. They were wrong. Kane turned to Admiral Catherine Sato, who stood with arms crossed, her gaze fixed on the fleet. She had been quiet throughout the briefing, weighing the risks. You still think this is a mistake? Kane asked. Sato exhaled slowly, tapping a finger against the console. I think we're out of options. That doesn't mean I like them. Neither did Kane. But war was rarely fought with good choices. He looked around the bridge, at the officers watching him, waiting for the final order. We execute this mission exactly as planned. No improvisation. No heroics. We board, extract the war council, and get out before their reinforcements close in. He paused, letting his next words settle. If we fail, Earth will not survive the week. There is no retreat. We finish this. A chorus of affirmations filled the room. Then the alarms blared. A ripple pulsed through the void, invisible to the naked eye, but deadly in its precision. It spread outward from the Nihilus, scanning for distortions in space. The cloaking fields flickered. In an instant, the fleet that had been undetectable became visible. Ren's fingers flew over the controls. They just scanned for cloaked vessels. Damn it. They saw us. Kane's jaw tightened. The Imperium was learning. "Engage," he ordered. The Vanguard roared to life, engines firing as its fleet surged forward. Plasma fire lanced through the dark, railgun slugs cutting through the void like meteor strikes. Human warships shed their invisibility and let loose, their weapons carving paths through enemy lines before the Imperium even had time to react. The Nihilus responded with brutal efficiency. Defense turrets activated, missile silos opened, and fighter squadrons launched in perfect formation. The warship was not unprotected. It was a fortress, and it had just been awakened. "Boarding teams, launch now." Kane barked. Drop ships detached from their carriers, engines flaring as they streaked toward the Nihilus like burning embers. Enemy flak fire tore through the space between them, ripping some apart before they reached the hull. Inside the lead drop ship, Lieutenant Callum Morgan braced herself as the vessel shuddered violently. "Stay tight," she ordered over the comms, her voice cutting through the chaos. The ship rocked as another explosion detonated too close. "We're coming in too fast," the pilot started. The impact slammed through them. Metal screeched as the docking clamps engaged, locking onto the Nihilus's hull. Morgan exhaled sharply. "We're in." The airlock hissed open. The war had just begun. The airlock's final seal disengaged with a sharp hiss, releasing a gust of pressurized air into the narrow corridor beyond. Lieutenant Callum Morgan was the first to move, stepping onto the Nihilus's cold, metallic flooring with practiced precision. The dim emergency lighting pulsed in rhythmic intervals, painting the corridor in alternating hues of red and shadow. For a command ship, it was eerily quiet. Too quiet. Behind her, the rest of her strike team poured in, weapons raised, scanning for movement. They had trained for this, breaching, clearing, securing. But this wasn't an ordinary warship. This was the Imperium's heart, the nerve center of their military operations. If the War Council was still aboard, they were walking into the most fortified section of the ship. Morgan pressed a hand to the side of her helmet. "Command, we've breached the outer corridor. No immediate resistance." Kane's voice came through, clipped but steady. "Move fast. We don't know how long it'll take for their security forces to regroup." Morgan gestured forward, and the team advanced, boots soundless against the polished floor. Every step was calculated, every movement deliberate. The Imperium ships were a masterclass in efficiency, clean, symmetrical, designed for function over aesthetic. But here, in the dim glow of the emergency lights, the corridors felt more like a tomb. Wren's voice crackled through the comms. "I don't like this." Neither did Morgan. The Imperium should have responded by now. There should have been security details, automated defenses, something. The ease of their entrance felt less like an advantage and more like a trap. They reached an intersection. Morgan signaled for a halt, then glanced down at her wrist display. The schematics they had stolen showed the War Council chamber 3 decks below. "Elevators are a no-go," said Sergeant Vance, adjusting the grip on his rifle. "They'll lock them down the second they realize we're here." Morgan nodded. "Maintenance shafts?" Vance scanned the walls before spotting a panel. He moved toward it, pulling out a small plasma cutter. The metal sizzled as the panel fell away, revealing a narrow crawl space leading downward. "This'll take us 2 decks down, but the last stretch we'll have to cross on foot." Morgan turned to the others. "We move in pairs. Stay quiet. No unnecessary engagements." One by one, they climbed into the shaft, descending into the heart of the Nihilus. High Lord Varesh watched the security feeds in silence. The humans had boarded his ship. They moved with a precision that defied expectation, their soldiers advancing with methodical efficiency. This was not the desperate resistance of a dying species. This was something else. They had underestimated them. Again, Varesh's second-in-command, Lord Iskar, shifted uneasily. "We should deploy the elite guard. Cut them down before they reach the war chamber." No, Varesh's voice was calm, almost thoughtful. His violet eyes flickered over the screens, watching the intruders disappear into the maintenance shafts. "They are not here to destroy the ship," he continued. "They are here for us." Iskar stiffened. "Then we should evacuate." Varesh's gaze snapped to him. "No, For centuries, the Imperium had ruled through fear. They had crushed empires, subjugated civilizations, rewritten history itself to maintain control. If he fled now, if he showed even a moment of weakness, that illusion would shatter. The humans wanted to strike at the heart of the Imperium, so he would let them come. He would show them why their kind had never won. Varesh turned away from the screens, clasping his hands behind his back. "Let them reach us," he said. "Then we will remind them of their place." Morgan's team emerged from the maintenance shaft onto the lower deck. The air was different here, thicker, charged. The War Council chamber was just ahead, beyond a set of reinforced blast doors. She gestured for her team to form up, then pressed a device against the control panel. Sparks flared as the lock disengaged. The doors groaned as they slid open. Inside, the war chamber was vast. A high-domed ceiling loomed overhead, walls lined with banners displaying the insignia of the Imperium. A long, obsidian table stretched across the room's center, and at the far end, seated with almost unnatural stillness, was High Lord Varesh. Morgan's rifle was trained on him before she fully stepped inside. "Don't move." Varesh did not. He merely studied her with an expression bordering on amusement. "You are bold," he said. His voice was deep, smooth, but there was no mistaking the weight behind it. "But foolish." A metallic hum filled the chamber. Morgan's instinct screamed, but it was already too late. The blast doors slammed shut behind them. Automated turrets unfolded from the walls. And from the shadows, elite Imperium guards stepped forward, weapons drawn, their armor gleaming under the dim lights. Varesh rose slowly. "You wanted a war," he said, his gaze burning into hers. "Now you have one." The chamber erupted in fire. Morgan dove behind a pillar as plasma rounds tore through the air, scorching deep furrows into the obsidian walls. The moment the blast doors had slammed shut, the war chamber had transformed into a kill box. Turrets whirred as they tracked movement, unleashing deadly bursts of energy. Imperium guards advanced with disciplined precision, their crimson armor gleaming beneath the flashes of gunfire. Her strike team scattered, taking cover where they could. Vance was already returning fire, his rifle sending armor-piercing rounds into the advancing forces. Two of the enemy guards went down, but more surged forward to take their place. Morgan pressed a hand to her helmet. "Command, we're compromised." It was a trap. Kane's voice came through, calm but edged with urgency. "Understood. Reinforcements inbound. Hold your ground." "Hold?" That was optimistic. Morgan risked a glance at the far end of the chamber. High Lord Varesh remained exactly where he had been, standing behind the long war table, his expression unreadable. He hadn't flinched when the firefight erupted. He hadn't moved when his guards began falling. He simply watched, as if he was waiting. Morgan clenched her jaw. If they didn't turn the fight in their favor soon, it wouldn't matter that reinforcements were on the way. They'd all be dead before help arrived. She switched channels. "Vance, suppressing fire on the left flank. Rook, give me a breach point on those turrets." Vance responded instantly, unleashing a barrage of suppressive fire that forced the enemy to shift position. Meanwhile, Rook, her demolitions expert, slid a compact charge from his belt and sprinted toward the nearest turret, narrowly dodging a plasma bolt that vaporized the floor behind him. A sudden flicker of movement caught Morgan's eye. One of the Imperium guards, faster than the others, broke formation and closed the distance between them. He was nearly on her before she could react. She spun, raising her rifle, but he was already inside her reach. A blade flashed. Pain lanced through her side as the vibro dagger bit into her armor, slicing deep into the flesh beneath. She gritted her teeth, using the momentum of her turn to drive an elbow into his throat. He staggered back, and she followed with a shot straight to the chest. The force of the impact sent him sprawling. Blood trickled beneath her armor, but she pushed the pain aside. She couldn't afford weakness. Then the air shifted. The gunfire, the shouting, the chaos, it all seemed to dull in an instant. A suffocating pressure filled the chamber, heavy and unnatural, as if the walls themselves were closing in. Morgan felt it coil around her like an unseen force, her breath catching in her throat. Varesh had moved, not walked, not stepped forward, but moved as if reality had been around him. His violet eyes locked onto hers. "You mistake this for a battle," he said, his voice impossibly calm. "It is not." A force slammed into her. Not physical, not something she could fight against. Her vision blurred, her body seized, and for a terrifying moment, she was weightless, caught in something vast and unseen. Then it was gone. She collapsed to her knees, gasping, her limbs shaking as if she had just been dragged through some unseen current. Around her, the rest of her team was experiencing the same. Vance was on the ground, struggling to breathe. Rook had collapsed mid-motion, his charge forgotten. Varesh exhaled, as if releasing them from an invisible grip. "You think yourselves predators," he said, "but you do not understand what you are hunting." Morgan gritted her teeth, forcing herself back to her feet. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to retreat, but she didn't. She steadied her rifle and aimed straight at Varesh's head. He smiled, then the walls detonated. A deafening explosion tore through the chamber as breach charges erupted in unison. The blast doors blew inward, and in the next instant, figures in black armor stormed inside, reinforcements from the vanguard, moving with lethal efficiency. Kane's voice cut through the ringing in Morgan's ears. "We're pulling you out. Now." She barely registered the hands grabbing her, dragging her toward the extraction point. Varesh remained standing in the chaos, untouched, watching them go. The last thing Morgan saw before she was pulled into the corridor was his eyes, still burning with something ancient, something that terrified her. The corridors of the Nihilus burned. Smoke curled through the air, thick with the scent of scorched metal and blood. The once pristine architecture of the Imperium's flagship lay in ruin. Walls buckled from explosions, lighting flickering in jagged pulses, the distant echoes of battle still raging through its depths. Lieutenant Callum Morgan ran. Her breath was ragged, her side throbbed from the knife wound, but she pushed forward, rifle clutched in a white-knuckled grip. Behind her, Vance covered their retreat, firing short, controlled bursts to keep pursuing Imperium soldiers at bay. Rook was limping, but still moving, still alive. They had failed. The mission had been simple in theory. Breach the Nihilus, capture High Lord Varesh, and dismantle the Imperium's leadership in one swift strike. It was the kind of decisive, impossible gamble humanity had always relied on. But Varesh had been waiting. Morgan could still feel the echo of his presence. Something beyond just a man, something vast and unknowable. He hadn't just seen them coming. He had let them in, and now he was letting them leave. The realization sent a shiver through her as she rounded the final corridor, spotting the extraction point ahead. Why? If he wanted them dead, they would be. He could have crushed them, mind and body, without ever lifting a weapon. So why was he letting them escape? The docking bay doors yawned open, revealing the boarding ships waiting beyond. Kane's voice crackled in her earpiece. "Get on that ship. Now." No hesitation. No questions. Morgan sprinted up the ramp, dragging Rook with her. The others followed, weapons raised, watching for signs of pursuit. None came. The moment the last soldier crossed the threshold, the doors slammed shut. A deep shudder ran through the ship as its engines roared to life, propelling them off the Nihilus and into the chaos beyond. The battle outside was reaching its peak. Human warships weaved between enemy formations, railgun rounds, and plasma fire slicing through the black. The Vanguard fought at the heart of the storm, its cannons hammering the Imperium's fleet with relentless force. Morgan collapsed into a seat, pressing a hand against her bleeding side. Across from her, Vance was already stripping off his ruined armor, checking for injuries. Rook, pale but grinning, let out a sharp laugh. "We're still breathing," he said. "That counts for something." Morgan barely heard him. Her thoughts were still on Varesh, on the way he had watched them leave, the way he had spoken before the trap was sprung. "You mistake this for a battle." She had thought it arrogance. Now she wasn't sure. The comms crackled again. This time it wasn't Kane. It was Varesh. His voice, smooth and cold, filled the cabin. "You fought well, Lieutenant Morgan." Silence fell. No one moved. Morgan sat up slowly. "How the hell are you on this channel?" "You took something from me tonight," Varesh continued as if she hadn't spoken. "But I allowed it. Because now, you will understand." The ship lurched violently. Outside the viewport, the battle was shifting. The Imperium fleet, so methodical, so disciplined, was withdrawing. Morgan's stomach twisted. "What is this?" Varesh's voice was a whisper now, threading through the comms like a shadow. "The real war has not yet begun." Then the transmission cut. The ship entered the Vanguard's hangar moments later. The doors sealed behind them. The battle was over. But Morgan knew, with a deep certainty that made her blood run cold. This had never been a war. It had been a warning. And humanity had only just begun to understand what it was fighting.